talking as soon? Okay.
All right, Scott, we're doing one take of this. You get what you get, and don't get upset with us. All right? So, English, you guys can start.
Okay, so we believe that English-only education is a more beneficial approach to teaching ELL students than bilingual education. So English-only education helps the students to develop better listening skills in the classroom, and in order for students to be able to communicate effectively in a language, they need to be good listeners as well as good speakers. And also, English-only education is cheaper to fund than bilingual education. So schools don't need to purchase extra materials or pay for any additional services for the students that do not speak English very strongly. And English-only education provides consistent instruction in the classroom, unlike bilingual education, which can often be inconsistent. So English-only students know what is expected of them in their classes, whereas a student of bilingual education may have difficulty with understanding their various expectations.
We also acknowledge that in any debate, there are some cons to the English-only education. Although with proper training, these cons can be avoided. The first con that we acknowledge is that they have a high failing rate. As a teacher, you can implement techniques such as using visuals or modeling to help the students succeed. Also, the children might have a hard time socializing. This can be avoided through the creation of a classroom environment that is accepted and inclusive. In an inclusive English-only classroom, socialization helps non-native English speakers develop basic interpersonal communication skills, which is vital for the development of English. Finally, some might argue that the learning process of students is slowed down because it's not taught in their native language. As a teacher, your job is to ensure the children are meeting the standards no matter what the challenge you face. Therefore, in order to make certain your students are understanding the information and are on track, you must implement many techniques. Some of these techniques might include scaffolding or cooperative learning.
So for the bilingual education, I believe it is important because it can help improve your English reading skills. So 3 takeaways from our argument is learning a second language can dramatically increase the empathy of students. They are better able to understand the different cultures and focus on social cues more closely in order to detect the language being used. Therefore, the students will develop empathy skills at a much earlier age if they are able to use their native language. It also focuses on diversity and inclusion. In our country, despite being a melting pot, it has extremely segregated schools in terms of culture. The bilingual education encourages new immigrants and established citizens to intermingle with each other. The benefits are increased diversity and integration of school systems, which will have benefits for all students, not only the bilingual. And then our third takeaway is a better performance and marketability. Almost every other country in the world encourages a bilingual education. Therefore, the bilingual education has a profound number of benefits that outweigh the cons of the English-only education. Financing is obviously a concern, but there are different problems to address within the bilingual education. Some cons that we would like to expose for the other party is it could be expensive, as I just said. Other students have already acquired a first language in their native level, so it could be harder to master a second. And the bilingual education may need to make content area education easier than a single language program.
All right, so we're ready for cross-examination?
Yeah.
All right.
Got this.
Okay. All right, well, this part of the debate where it's going to get heated. All right, so first question for the English-only side is many schools in America are already struggling to meet basic educational standards in the classroom. Some schools lack the proper resources. This includes textbooks, computers, most importantly, well-trained teachers. So my question to you is why should schools implement bilingual education if they cannot even provide basic amenities like textbooks, computers, well-qualified teachers to their English-speaking students?
All right, so I'm going to take that one, Shane, from you.
Okay. All right.
I would say I think definitely any school system has its difficulties in prioritizing resources, especially as you go, and you're going to be finding more people, ELL students in inner city schools, which are going to have less financing. But I think just financing obviously should be a concern for all schools, but also probably going the bilingual route is going to be a better method in terms of things. And I think you can go through, and obviously it's going to be difficult and you're going to have those resources, but the bilingual education is probably for those students going to be more beneficial in the long run. As Anna said, it probably is going to increase their marketability. So if you go through and let's say, Scott talked about how he had a lot of German speaking students, I think it was German, in Pocono Mountain, right? German, if you go into financing, right? Frankfurt is the finance center of Europe. You already have one leg on people. You're able to communicate with those people there. They probably can speak English too, but having the fact to say, well, I can also speak German means you're going to have one less language barrier to go over. So yeah, there's definitely a price con, but that's all budgets. All budgets are weighing the costs and benefits of things. So, but it's a valid point, but I don't think it's as large as a concern as you make it out to be.
Okay. All right. So my next question to you is, now many people might argue that separating students based on their language could be fall under the category of the discriminating. So what do you think about this? Like, do you think it is discriminating to separate students based off their language in the classroom?
I would say there's a valid argument for that, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think that's always been a battle in school systems, and especially as you go to least restrictive learning environment and LREs, etc. But I also think going and having those students where they can be taught either in their own language or be outside the classroom, least restrictive environment, your goal is to get those students to be in the general education classroom as long as possible. And for ELLs, especially resources wise, it may be necessary that you have to have pull-out programs. So I think there's a valid argument, but it's weighing those, and I think that's something that the individual school district is determining and going through, because you're going and saying, well, okay, one child may have this disability. Two children may have the exact same disability. One may be in the general education classroom all day long, and another one has to go out and is pulled out twice a day. It's hard to make the argument of saying, okay, well, that's discrimination. That child should be in the general learning. You don't necessarily know those child's individual needs, and maybe for them that's working better. There's research evolves to show the other, and obviously that's something that's still evolving. I think I'd be open to reevaluating.
Okay. All right. So our final question for the bilingual team is, students are already required to learn various subjects while in school. Due to the extensive amount of information students are already required to know, much time is dedicated to retain information in their classes. Incorporating a bilingual education will not only be time-consuming, but it'll put a strain on the individual student. Students in a bilingual education face social strain, such as being criticized by their peers and teachers for not understanding the language. So my question is, what are the social benefits of bilingual education for students?
Well, first of all, I think if you're going off of the social bullying, etc., I think that's something that the administration should be handling, and I think a lot of schools are getting much better on that and going through anti-bullying policies. A lot of schools now have adopted zero tolerance for bullying, and I think that's an argument for another time. has its own ups and downs. But I don't think you should tolerate someone, bullying someone because they can't speak English. And I think and I think that's with our generation, a lot more people, sorry, there's a motorcycle driving by if you see that, you hear that? And I think a lot of people in our generation are more open to people with different languages and not being able to understand English. The US, a lot of places, everyone speaks English, but if you go over into Europe, for example, a lot of those countries, people working there, yeah, they speak English, but they also have multiple other languages with them. So definitely, I don't think you can discount those social challenges that those students experience, but also going through and recognizing that it's not, the root of the problem isn't the bilingual education of students. It's the root of the problem is students not being taught that just because someone can't speak English well, or is an immigrant, should be a higher priority and be taught to those students.
Okay. All right. Well, that's our questions for you, and we are now going to turn the tables to the bilingual education. So you can ask us questions now.
All right. So my questions aren't necessarily as in depth, but I think they have valid points. So why are you? The United States, we're not the number one in education per se, but why are you supporting an English-only classroom when other countries are already striving towards bilingual education? I know in your Finland presentation that you talked about how most of the people in the country speak English, and then they also speak two or even three other languages, German, and other languages surrounding there. So kind of my question is, why is an English-only education good when basically the rest of the world is striving towards bilingual or multilingual education?
Well, despite other countries striving towards bilingual education, we are supporting an English-only classroom because it maximizes those students' exposure to the English language. And one of the main goals for ELL students is to get them to speak English at a proficient level. So reaching proficiency in the English language will allow them to interact more with their peers as well as their teachers. It helps them to understand what's expected from them in the classroom. So they're able to understand their assignments better, the directions they're to follow along. And it also, being more confident speaking English in real world situations outside of the classroom as well, because if they moved here from another country, there's a high probability that they're going to need to know some English. So.
All right. Thanks. I appreciate that. Our kind of second question, going on, the other side of the coin that Shane mentioned, is that discrimination question. Would you consider it segregating students, though, if you discourage them from using their native language? So, that's a big portion of their culture. Why can't those kids be like, well, I understand the importance of English, but I want to be able to still communicate in my native language, the one that I grew up with. That's what I speak at home. So kind of, how's the argument for that developed?
So discouraging students from using their native language, we don't consider to be segregating them necessarily. Encouraging students to only speak English in the classroom or speak it as much as possible. They're learning how to communicate with their peers, like I said before. This approach allows schools to potentially help end any kind of segregation that might be occurring for the ELL student or students that don't speak English.
In addition to this, English-only classrooms, they do not segregate students based on their native language. The students who speak a language other than English are fully integrated to the classroom and participate in all activities. Instead of being placed in a classroom with only students that speak their same language, the students are fully immersed and treated as any other student. And students whose native language is not English are still held to the same high standards and expectations as the native English speakers.
Okay, thanks. That's a valid point. And our third question is kind of, I know you guys brought up money a lot of times. Should money be the overall factor of not allowing a student to receive a full, diverse, and exclusive education? You know, should money be really that factor in going in a world where diversity and globalization is more important? Why are you going to make money the factor that cuts that out?
Yeah, so that's a great question. As we talked about before, money's a very important factor that needs to be taken account in all education. As we all know, teachers don't get paid enough, students barely have enough resources. So that's where, so as a nation, there's a huge shortage of funding for schools. So it's a huge issue that just can't be solved overnight. So that's why we're supporting English only because where is this money going to come from to pay for the bilingual education? In addition to not having enough school supplies, as I mentioned, teachers aren't paid, and with bilingual education, you'd have to pay for extra teachers who speak multiple languages and might even have higher degrees of education, such as masters and such, causing it to be more expensive. So yes, we have to take into account the funding for bilingual education when deciding whether or not to implement it in our school system.
Just something else to add to that is, money is, I think it's something we can all, like, both sides can agree on, is it's definitely an issue for the bilingual education. So something that I did find that was interesting was, did some research, found that this from University of Texas, talking about how, and also Texas, before I get into just briefly about it, the study was, Texas is, I believe it said it was like it's one of the top states that has the highest enrollment of ELL students. And I think a big issue that they have is they don't get enough funding from the state or the federal government. And this could also just put a big strain on their, budget and financial resources. And it's said that they found that it costs up to like $9,000 up to, so it's not saying it's always $9,000, but it costs up $9,000 per student. So if you think about it, you have a school with a couple hundred ELL students, it's thousands of dollars per student. So I think the study was just interesting, showing how, while bilingual education, you definitely present some very valid points. It just, there's this looming, cloud of finance, I guess you want to call it. And it could be really taxing on, especially, it also, the article or the study discussed places that are poverty stricken. And so we obviously know if you're a school in a very low income area, a lot of times public schools, it can be determined by their housing or the property value. So if you have a low income area, their schools are not going to have as much resources. So that's already an issue that's already there. So if you're adding on to the bilingual program, you're going to start, sucking more dollars into a different direction where it should be. In some, like, schools in parts of Texas, they do need money in different areas. So I just added that. I just thought it was an interesting point.
All right. I think that's really valid, and I think I was both sides brought up for debate some very valid points. I don't know for English if you guys want to wrap up with those closing points.
Oh yeah. So our closing is English only education is the most effective form of instruction when teaching ELL students. Students who are learning English will benefit from persistent exposure to the new language, this being English, by being fully immersed in it. Oftentimes, the best way to learn any language is to be surrounded by others who speak it on a daily basis. A student who is immersed in the language and listens to others speak it on a regular basis will not only become better listeners, the social skills amongst other students will, as a result, improve. Listening to others' opinions and statements is a fundamental skill. And eventually, the individual student will develop better speaking skills through repetition and constant exposure to the English language. While bilingual education may appear to have various benefits, it has a major deficiency. And as we said before, it's a financial cost. Some schools may be financially stable enough to implement a bilingual education program, but many do not have sufficient funding to do so. Schools should be focusing on supplying the basic needs of students and teachers before any other programs are introduced. A few basic requirements that need to be satisfied before anything else include hiring qualified teachers, as we discussed, a couple times before, providing adequate school supplies. That could come down to the basic necessities like paper, pencils, having some kind of media resources, maybe like a computer lab, and also essential school amenities. This can, again, go to very basic things like heat, air conditioning, to ensure that the students are comfortable, as well as teachers, because that can, if they're not comfortable, if they're having issues like such as those simple basic problems, they could affect their learning. So to wrap it up, it is clear that many schools across the nation are suffering from insufficient fundings to meet the basic needs of students. And implementing a bilingual education program will essentially only set the schools back further. And that's all I have to say.
Nora, you want to wrap up for our side?
Okay, so for closing, I would like to address 3 points as a bilingual education side. So firstly, learning a second language can increase empathy and adaptability of students. The language does not just make students learn grammar, but also a new culture and new way of life. This benefits the students by giving the student a broader outlook on life, which essentially increases the emotion of empathy. I think empathy is the most important thing during this pandemic. And secondly, diversity and inclusion. It creates more cultural opportunities to meet with people in different backgrounds. This helps students to understand the world around them. It helps them grow up more open-minded and accept differences. This allows students to encourage and accept the diversity and inclusive principles in the classroom. And finally, bilingual students generally perform better due to the further development for functions such as switching attention from the native language to English and working memory. Although bilingual education is more costly, it allows students to obtain skills such as multitasking decision-making and problem solving, which are skills used in everyday life. I think that's all.
Yep, I think that's about it. So hopefully that's what you wanted, Scott. So I'm going to end the recording right about now.